Guys, welcome to Tommy's Outdoors. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Good afternoon.
I think, as usually in those cases, the only fair way to start is with a round of introductions. So, introduction to our listeners so they know who they're dealing with.
Well, I'll go first then, Kendrew. My name's Stu Bearhop. I'm a professor of Animal Ecology at the University of Exeter. And I headed up two work packages around surveying seabirds in the west of Scotland.
These are MarPAMM packages.
Yeah, MarPAMM, which is this big Interreg funded project.
And my name's Kendrew Colhoun, and I have been involved in the MarPAMM project since about a year in. My role has been various things. It's always involved in the sort of seabird end of things. But I've jumped between various of the project partners during the last couple of years. So my role for example, with Stuart's project has been helping AFBI and helping Stuart and team do their these externally funded pieces of work that either Exeter or the British Ornithology have done most of. So that's my kind of role in things.
So, folks, like in general, what consists of this work package, and then how it feeds into a larger MarPAMM project?
So there are 5 work packages in MarPAMM, and the one that Stuart and I are involved in as T1, which is about Seabird monitoring, modelling, and so on. Other ones are on all sorts of things, including sedimentology and oceanography and so on, and actually marine management planning. The idea behind the T1 work package, the Seabirds focused one, is really about collecting and working with the data through either monitoring population trajectories, population sizes, distribution, and maybe modelling their movements through tracking types of work. That is designed to inform the other work packages, for example, the marine management planning elements. So the work that the Stuart and his colleagues from Exeter, a very big piece of work was involved with part of this population monitoring work. That is basically what seems a rather basic, but it's a gargantuan task of monitoring the health of seabird populations in an area that is remote, difficult, awkward, and hasn't been done for a decade. So Stuart grasped that project by the neck and has been, and I'm sure he'll describe the detail of that, doing that sort of work on the west coast of Scotland last summer. It's been knocked by COVID, of course, that like many elements of the project. And in terms of kind of where it fits into the bigger picture is obviously we were doing bits of pieces of that sort of work in Northern Ireland as well, but there was a big gap in west coast of Scotland that needed external expertise, and I'll now point that in Stuart's direction because he is the man I'm pointing at.
Yeah, so there was kind of three sets of seabirds we were surveying. We were picking up some of the cliff nesting seabird surveys that had been missed in the large scale survey that was undertaken just prior to COVID. So there was a few gaps in that survey that needed filled around the island of Skye, small isles, Rum and Muck, and then some of the islands around the Outer Hebrides, some of the more remote islands around the Outer Hebrides, like the Flannan Islands and places like that. There was a large survey of the ground nesting seabirds on Lewis. There's a big moorland in the north of Lewis where birds like skuas and terns and gulls nest. And that was a huge piece of work where we had about a dozen people walking 20-mile transects daily for about a week to cover the entire area. And then a much more complex set of data collection of burrow nesting shearwaters and petrels. And that is really kind of, certainly after the fieldwork, that was the stuff that took most of our time because it was really a very complex modelling exercise and data annotation exercise post-collection. So the collection was really just the start of it. The analysis was what really took most of our efforts, and that really took up, well, it was originally going to be a 2-year project crammed into one, so it really took up the last 6 months and a lot of work on, by a couple of other people who'd put in most of the work into that who aren't here today, but they did a lot of the work involved in that.
What are you expecting to see from those models? So what's the purpose of those models? Is it prediction of the population growth dynamics, or is it like migration patterns, or
it's
everything?
Really unsatisfying. It's a single number that is the number of seabirds that we think of that species are on a given island. So in this instance, these approaches allow us to not just give a single number, but say, well, we think this number lies within this range because we have lots of sources of error. Because essentially what we're doing there is, if you imagine one of the species we were trying to estimate the population size of was the Manx shearwater, which nests in the mountains of Rum. And the mountains of Rum are, about 800 meters, let's say, and they are quite precipitous. And the birds are nesting in lots of places we can't get to. So we can't count every single burrow. I should have also said they nest inside burrows, so they're not even visible. They only come ashore at night. So what you can't do is count every single bird that's there. You have to use indirect approaches, and that involves all sorts of things like finding burrows, playing recordings down burrows, sticking cameras down burrows to see if they're occupied. And there's lots of sources of uncertainty in that part. There's also then we can't visit every area of the bird's nest, partly because we don't have time and it's logistically very challenging, and partly because they're in places that our health and safety executives would not allow us near. And so it involves lots of uncertainty. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, well, we know how many occupied burrows there is in this square we've counted. How many such squares exist on the island? And we have to use essentially a geographic information system where we look at satellite photographs and we map our densities onto pixels from the satellite photographs, and then we build a model that predicts density, and then we extrapolate that across the size of the colony, but then we have to multiply up the uncertainty we have about whether a burrow is occupied or not, because you play the tape and not all birds respond, and so it becomes quite a complex process. So we end up with actually quite honest numbers, but quite unsatisfying numbers. We have quite large sources of error, and it's the same with the petrel counts. It's just slightly easier to do the petrel counts, but the modelling exercise post petrel count is just as complicated.
Yeah, this is this thing where people are talking about the number of birds or number of bears or number of deers. Like, tell me how many it is. Like 25,000, 2071.
Yeah.
Right? And there's like, no. It's just
that's how many you counted. That's not how many there are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's tricky because, of course, when you get something like 29,331, it suggests that you have the ability to know that to the nearest bear how many bears there are. But of course, there's a level. There's no way in this single counts of actually assessing where the error lies. The great thing about these approaches we do with the petrels and shearwaters is that we know where the error is, and so we can provide a count with some uncertainty. Now, that becomes less satisfying because there is so much uncertainty in these models. For example, we're not really 100% sure of the area occupied by the shearwaters on Rum, because again, some of the areas you just can't get to because they're at the bottom of cliffs and things like that. So we have to allow for some uncertainty there as well. So in the Manx shearwater instance, I can dig the figures out for you. I haven't got them to hand at the moment. I should have done that. I'll dig them out for you. But it was a big number. It's like 200,000+ birds. And our estimate was a good bit higher than the previous estimate, largely because we think the colony is much bigger than it was previously, or than was previously surveyed. We're not really sure whether the colony was always bigger and one bit wasn't surveyed, or whether that bit has been colonized in more depth in recent years.
Gotcha. And tell me, is once you have this number and you have some, approximation or extrapolation of the data, are you also able to predict or estimate the growth or the trend of the population, whether it's declining, or whether it's growing? Because this is kind of ties to the question, when was the last survey done? And we already heard that there was like a decades ago or something like that. So I'm curious if you're able to predict population dynamic from what you're doing.
So this has been a bit of a bone of contention. Well, not a bone of contention. It's been a lot. We spent a lot of time discussing this. So for the counts, for the direct counts of birds on cliffs and birds nesting On moorland, yes, there's a direct comparison. And we can directly compare those to previous studies because the method is identical. And there were some stories, like we saw a dramatic reduction in fulmars around those coasts. The fulmar petrels have kind of declined a lot, and we're not really sure why. Although we do know that white-tailed eagles like eating fulmars, and there's a lot more white-tailed eagles up there now, but that is purely it's purely correlative at the moment. But with the petrels and the shearwaters, it becomes a bit more problematic because we were applying, you can imagine that 20 years is a long time. Our ability to, the power in computers has increased dramatically in that time. So we can actually deploy much more complex models than we used to. And endoscopes are you can buy endoscopes to stick cameras down burrows nowadays for a few £100, whereas they were costing tens of thousands of pounds, 20 years ago. So technology means that we can survey these things in quite different ways to the way we used to. And so we, in conjunction with Kendrew and other people on the steering group, we decided to go for the most up-to-date mode of, or use the most up-to-date techniques for assessing population size. And of course, that does mean that it's slightly tricky to set the numbers we've counted in a historic context. Although we did do retrospective fits using approximations of the previous techniques. And for the shearwaters, there's probably been a bit of an increase, but if we take just the area of colony that was counted in the previous surveys, there might be a small increase there, but it doesn't look too different. With the petrels, it does look like there's been some change in numbers, but it's very, very difficult to know what to make of those because we employed this new distance sampling approach, whereas previously field workers were going out and they were basically playing calls down every burrow they could find. So it was a searching exercise, whereas this new exercise is, now, that's really good if you've got skilled people, and there were very skilled people doing that. But all those skilled people get older and eventually can't go onto islands. And of course, it then becomes problematic to get other people trained up to that. What we did is we set fixed transects through the habitat and fixed areas where we were playing the calls. And then we use this distance sampling approach so we can measure the distance to different calls. And from that, we can use a model to estimate density. Now, trying to turn that approach into the previous approach is retrofit it is not very easy. And so we did do a bit of that, and it's a bit equivocal whether there's been any change or not. The great thing now is that we have GPS fixes from every point that we surveyed, and so people can go back to those places and then repeat these surveys. So it's a kind of, in those petrol surveys, we hope it's a new baseline, I think, rather than something that we can compare to the historic values. Certainly the NGOs and the statutory agencies would be horrified if they thought I was going to try and say there was increases in numbers or decreases in numbers based on these new approaches we took.
You mentioned that you were playing sounds down to the burrows, and like, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
So so it's quite a complex. So we, the cameras were used for one set. The cameras were used for something called a calibration, right? And that was where we were trying to work out, given if a burrow was occupied, what is the likelihood a bird responds to a call, right? I'm going to play you the kind of calls we play. I'll let you hear it. This is not the tape we played. This is... So those are Manx shearwaters. And
I have leeches here. Stu, if you want me to play it.
You can play leeches petrel.
Let me fast. That's female leeches petrel and male.
And that what we did was we played that wasn't the call that I played you of the shearwaters was just a single. I think it was probably just a female. We played both male and female calls down the burrows because obviously males are, we might expect males and females to respond differently to calls of different sexes. And so we play that for a standard length, and then we wait, and then we wait on a response. And it's actually it's fantastic when the birds start calling at you when you're playing. There's something really lovely. I've got a lovely little video of us really right up at the top of one of the highest mountains in Mull with a transect, and we're playing, and it's a beautiful day, the view's incredible, and then there's this the birds eventually, the shearwaters form, they're like little ecosystem engineers. They nest in between rocks, but of course over the years their feces builds up and then vegetation grows, and they have these beautiful bright green, they're called shearwater greens, these bright green areas that their burrows go into. So it's really lovely colours and just really great fun. I mean, really actually got me back, really desperately back into fieldwork again, really made me reevaluate this sitting at a desk and pushing papers around. So I really got back into fieldwork. So it was great. So yeah, so we play the calls, we listen for a response over a standard time period, then we log whether the burrows are occupied or not. And that is basically, I can't remember how many I've got. I'll dig out the summaries, but we played a tape like that, something like over 11,000 times as a group of people. So as you can imagine, by the end of it, the actual tape became a bit repetitive, you know. But anyway, it was really good fun, and so that was and I guess the other thing that's really quite evocative about it is, of course, the birds only come ashore at night, so you only hear these things at night. And when you're up there in the evening and the birds are coming in, the noise is incredible, because you know you're talking about 200,000 occupied burrows. That's 400,000 plus birds potentially, you know, swirling around the mountains of Rum. It's a lot of animals making a lot of noise.
Yeah, I can only imagine that it was fantastic. And look, this is a reoccurring theme when I talk with the researchers, with the scientists, that they all love the field work, but then that field work is like a tiny fraction of the of the actual work, and the rest is in the office, which everybody would prefer to be like out camping and dealing with birds all the time.
Yes, that's very true.
Listen, Stu, how many people were used in during those surveys? Because it seems like a massive task.
Yeah, we had a team of 8 on Rum, and that was 4 teams of 2 surveying, and then we had actually a couple of people from Nature Scott came over to help us for one day, and then we had a team of I think about 12 on Lewis and doing the moorland surveys, and then there was another couple of teams of half a dozen each, I think, that went round the various small islands and various bits. Some of them ended up on North Rona, one of the most remote islands in the British Isles, to play the calls that Kendrew just played, to survey for leeches, petrels, and storm petrels. And that's a hard island to get to and a hard island to get onto, because there's no real safe landings on it, and they have to be aware of the weather at all time, because you know if they don't watch the weather, they can get stranded on there for weeks on end. So, and there's no water and food or anything like that on there. So it's quite a serious undertaking, some of the places that we went to.
Wow, I didn't realize. Listen, guys, I have a few kind of like a very basic layman questions. And the first one is like, we dealing here with seabirds. So what constitutes a seabird? Is a seabird, does it need to be in a vicinity of the shoreline for breeding, or is it like a percentage of life history spent on the shore? And because like people go on to the beach and they see geese, and it's like, well, like not exactly consider geese a seabird, right?
So there is a it's not an official definition, but there is a definition that tends to be widely used, and it's any bird that gets its food from below the low water mark. So that excludes oyster catchers and curlews and brent geese and shell ducks and things like that, because they're foraging intertidally. So anything that essentially, it's mostly stuff that catches fish, but of course there's a few seabirds that eat zooplankton and things like that. Some of the small auks eat zooplankton, but it's generally something, a bird that gets its food from below the low.
With a very nice, tidy definition. I never thought about that.
But it becomes complicated because, of course, things like loons and grebes are seabirds in winter. Seabirds in winter, but freshwater birds in summer.
There's always like in nature, it just doesn't, it just refuses to be categorized and boxed into like, oh, this is a seabird, but only in winter.
yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Listen, another question I have. When I was reading for this podcast, I've noticed there are a number of birds is that their nesting strategies are different. They're burrow nesting, they're cliff nesting. Can you lay it out to us? Like, what are those? Is this really? Is this even a way of categorizing seabirds by the way they're nesting? And if yes, what are those types of nesting strategies?
Yes, it is. I mean, it is. I think it's a fair way of categorizing them. We tend to think of cliff nesters and burrow nesters. Burrow nesters and boulder nesters probably get mashed into one. So and it tends to be about body size. So the small things tend to nest in burrows and in amongst boulders because that's a way of them protecting themselves from aerial predators like gulls and skuas. And the slightly larger, as they get larger, they're better able to protect themselves. So things like guillemots nest really densely on ledges, so that when gulls come in, there's all the beaks pointing up at them, and the gulls can't get in amongst them. And so those are ledge nesters. Kittiwakes are small gulls, but probably a bit bigger and a bit harder to rob. Although we know that some skuas are very efficient killers and robbers of kittiwake nests. So they're a bit unusual in that respect. They tend to try and avoid places where there are those predators. But I think it's largely about body size. And you can imagine getting into a rock between a boulders becomes quite hard when you're the size of an albatross.
Some statistics there on Stuart and team's work, which was it was all epic on various levels, but the rum stuff here, this maybe is a bit out of date now, Stu, but here, this will be familiar to you. Team of 8 spent 3 weeks on rum, 90,000 metres of mountain climbed, 100,000 plus square metres of habitat surveyed, 11,000 plus burrows counted, 3.5 full days of doing playback. Now, that is probably a little bit out of date, but that
I think that was pretty close to what we ended up with.
I mean, looking at the Strava type stuff, it was just epic.
Well, I lost 5 kilos. I lost 5 kilos in 3 weeks.
Wow, very good.
Luckily, the weather was nice. It was. I mean, it was. Yeah. As Stu says, you've got, the real challenging bit was for any seabird population monitoring are these cryptic nocturnal species. Because they'll get predated if they come in during the day. So, you go to these islands and to all intents and purposes, it's full of a rabbit warren, but actually underneath your feet are all these birds sitting, incubating an egg or attending a chick, or just later on in the breeding season, a chick on its own. And it's only when you get this call down, and although we know to play a call and we get a response, it's a most simplistic thing ever, but it's actually not always exciting, not exciting after 2 weeks of it intensely, but the first day is pretty cool when you're getting a response. But it's incredibly, the fascinating bit for me here is that obviously the big headline is that everyone wants to know is how many are there, and Stuart's described how you get an estimate and you get a range either side of it, but we're also thinking of, because of climate change and all of these impacts, we're interested in how that changes. And there's always a tension between, well, will we improve our method? But if we improve our method and it's better, did we just count them better, or are there actually more? That's always which you've talked about, is always a tricky one. But it's particularly tricky on these big, massive colonies of burrow nesting species. And as Stu said, they've established a baseline now with. So one way to monitor these trends is to go to those GPS reference points, go to enough of them that allow for maybe changes to the density of the colony through time. But that is a really good index of population change, which is really important in the world we live in, so that maybe not in 20 years' time, but maybe more frequently, we can get a better handle. So sometimes you've got to bite the bullet and go, you know what, we've got to do these, maybe establish the best baseline possible, and if new methods come along, then we do that. And the other thing about it is, of course, is that to arrive at that simple number at the range around it is an extremely complex statistical process, which is why people like Stu and team are doing this stuff, because, the field work, apart from being a physical slog, is fairly easy. You could have a give someone direction and they could probably go and do that. It's the designing that field work and the making sense of it, of the data that comes out of it, is the real intellectual stuff that is very, very complex. Hats off to them, both for the physical and the intellectual input. It was a mammoth job at all levels, and very impressive. But those other species, like Stu's mentioned about the gulls and so on, the cliff nesters, they're so, they're much easier. They're not. You get caves with 10,000 guillemots in it that you just can't possibly see them all. But you'll get a lot of guillemots and ledges, and you can photograph them, and you can count them, and you can do so that therefore the much more robust population counts of those, and therefore more robust indices of population change on those. But the shearwaters and petrels are a different beast entirely, at least in the northern hemisphere.
And bear in mind, when I actually did, there were these constant effort plots on RUM that were established, I think, in the 60s or the 70s. So there's these grids where people count all the burrows. And I went up with my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, just before I started my PhD in the mid-90s with him. And this is the days before miniaturized speakers and, MP3s and things like that. And what we had to do was we put a match upright in the entrance to the burrow, and we put matches upright in the entrance to all the burrows, and then go back the next day and see what ones have been knocked over, and that's how
Wow.
burrows were occupied or not.
And that they do, the people tracking these birds do that. Yes, we're using all sorts of fancy electronic devices, but actually you might put an electronic device on the bird that's cutting edge to tell it GPS positions for its movements, etc. But actually, it's a very low tech approach to actually know, did the bird come home, so that whenever the bird that comes out of do you put then a nest trap on the bird, because the bird that you're interested in has now got, the burrow has been occupied. You go to these sites, like Stuart said, you can imagine 400,000 birds flying around, and you're trying to study a particular burrow. There's so many birds going around, and they land and then they walk 10 meters and they disappear down the burrow. That's a whole different end of things, which is also fascinating. And these, we're all interested in movements of these things, and it wasn't part of this project that Stuart and team were doing, but as part of our work has been looking at these things are migrating to, where they're foraging. It's amazing. But sticking on the Manx shearwaters, we had Manx shearwaters from Northern Ireland that were going up around RUM foraging during the day. So they were obviously mixing with those birds. And then, of course, we'll know now, and it's well known, but over winter migrations, these birds are going to off Argentina for our winter, the southern summer. They're amazing animals altogether. All the more amazing because you don't see them very much during the day, and the only time you do see them is out in the pitch black with a head torch on.
I just want to ask a quick question about those models. Are these machine learning models, AI, or is it statistical models?
No, they're just statistical. They're Bayesian. They're Bayesian statistical models. So the shearwater model has, I'm actually looking at it up here. It has a bit where we model the uncertainty of occupancy, and we a bit where we model the density. And then one of my PhD students, Luke, built this really nice predictive model that essentially mapped our actual counts of burrows onto a greenness index, and then we worked out what the correlation was, then we extrapolated that across the colony. And the other thing that was really good that he did was really clever was, of course, the problem is when you look at it in 2 dimensions, the area looks quite small, but these things are on the size of mountains like that. So actually, a 20 by 20 meter square in 2 dimensions is much, much bigger when you take into account elevation. So he built an elevation model as part of that. So we that's where some of the area changes come from, because we have a much more accurate area model. So then once you've got that, then you can take your predictions and then you can and your actual estimates and multiply the whole thing up, and you take all of that uncertainty with you, which is why you end up with these kind of wide estimates.
Oh, this is really like a monumental task. And folks, tell me, are you limiting the bird species, or do you have those species of interest? I'm just stealing the term from one of the previous MarPAMM episodes, or are you just trying to do best you can for all the species that you encounter?
Well, for the project, those birds were identified by the project coordinators, and those were birds where either the data were deficient or the sites had been missed during the large scale survey that had happened prior to COVID.
No, I think that's right, Stu. Those species are particularly important. That work package that Stu and team did the work on was cliff-stroke ground nesting species in these remote areas that haven't been counted. Many of which are really important because obviously the UK, Ireland seabird populations are incredibly important globally for species including Manx shearwater leech petrels, for example, and then the burrow nesters, which are the particularly challenging ones, the shearwaters and petrels. Again, really, I've already said that the leeches and Manx are two of the species for which Irish and European storm petrel, all three of them are really important in a global context.
And in Manx in particular, pretty much all of the world's breeding population are in the islands around Britain and Ireland. I mean, that's pretty much. I mean, there's a few in Iceland, there's a few down the Azores, there's a few dotted elsewhere, but this is basically the core.
So we found at one of our study sites, we have a small colony of what we think is 40, just 40. So you can imagine you would survey them a different way. And one of the ways it was kind of inspired by Stuart and colleagues, really cool thing to be involved in was testing sniffer dogs on this, because, one of the problems of the statistics that Stu and colleagues encounter is that, so you have to calibrate your response rate, because not every bird, there could be a burrow occupied, but not every bird will answer you back. And you're dependent on that, and that varies with site, with year, with the sex of the bird, with the personality of the bird, perhaps, with all sorts of things. So obviously, like Stu and team would have done an island-specific calibration, so that that actually only 1 out of 2 occupied burrows actually gives you an answer. You get a dog involved, and maybe on some islands you've got shared burrows with rabbits and puffins and even petrels. I don't know that you get 4 cohabiting species, but you may get 2 very often. But Mr. Dog and Stuart's dog there is in the background. The ability of these doggies to detect and differentiate is extraordinary. And we've tested this last summer, and we're doing more this year, and looking at basically tuning the dog into a scent, which the professional conservation detection dogs, Caroline Finlay and those people are really got it nailed. There's no different to drug or weapons detection, same principles, but they can get them tuned into the smell. I mean, we think actually there's quite a difference between a large chick, because they're not as oily, and in a burrow versus an adult, or a recently occupied burrow that that an adult is not in, but was in the night before, and so on. And of course, by doing that and refining and calibrating that approach, it enables you to get some of these uncertainties away, because it immediately, for example, very difficult but very basic factor that you extrapolate to, which is the colony size. Well, actually, if you can delimit your area quite accurately, where is the colony on the island? Well, actually, that's probably an extremely efficient way of doing it, because the dog's ability to wag its tail and signal to you or not is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I agree, Kendrew. I think that is going to be the way forward. I think we've been talking to some of the teams that are thinking about how they take this forward, and we've been very strongly advocating dogs removing the tape playback, because then the dogs can basically tell you how many burrows are occupied in a square, so you can take that calibration away and all of the error associated with that goes. You just need to get the dogs to the plots and walk the dogs inside the plots. And then secondly, the area, which is really important. And another thing that the dogs, I think, would be really good for is, one of the problems you find is that as you start playing tapes, everyone in the area around the tape starts to hear it, and that changes their likelihood of responding. So it becomes really problem. When you've got highly dense colonies, you have to think of ways of spacing out the plagues, whereas you don't need that, because you don't prime the birds at all with a dog. The dog just sniffs, it tells you. And so I think dogs are absolutely the way to do this in the future, because it will remove 2 big sources of uncertainty, the area and the likelihood of the response.
Yeah, totally agree, Stuart. I mean, I mean, I hadn't really thought of this stuff and hadn't seen the dogs in action, but we trialled a dog on one large colony of at Copeland Island, and then on the very small one that said there's about 40. Well, actually, we know a pretty precise number because in that situation, it's yes, a small island and it doesn't have many Manx shearwaters, but actually, it has lots of burrows that have petrels and rabbits in it, but we're actually very easily check the island and go, no, all the shearwaters are in this one area, and then you can just go burrow by burrow, and you can actually do an absolute count of them. Now that's the simplest version possible, of course, but it works.
And the other big thing, I think, having been there, was infrared endoscopes. If we get infrared endoscopes, then, because one of the problems with endoscopes is that you can get, once you've got an endoscope, like once you're up to here in mud and you've got an endoscope that's maybe going a metre or two, it's really hard to work out what way it's pointing or where. And then you can sometimes have a bird right in the centre and you think it looks like a moss, and then all of a sudden you see an eye, you go, it's the bird. Whereas if you had an infrared endoscope, you could just do it from, a metre away, you would see that bird. So infrared endoscope would be a way of ground truthing your dogs as well.
I'm totally rubbish with them. And the other thing that because we were tracking birds this summer, again, these Manxies and Stormies, you go out with thermal imaging equipment, total game changer, because, these birds are flying around the dark, lights do put them off. But, if you could sit beside a burrow with a pair of thermal imaging binoculars, bird probably doesn't see you, doesn't really know what's going on, but it's just landed at your feet. And then all of a sudden, it's your bird, and, you're sitting in the dark effectively, and a Manx shearwater or a Manx shearwater poo glows white at night. It's incredible.
That's a highlight of this episode. Wow, especially dogs. Like, how dog letting you know what species of bird it found? Does it bark once or twice depending on the species, or how does that work?
The technique, and I don't want to betray any secrets from these conservation dog handlers now that are making, that they're definitely training lots of conservation dogs to do different things. But you could effectively take Stu's Labrador there. Once they get into I'm sorry, I'm not going to describe this very eloquently, but they get into a routine of finding a certain kind of neutral scent. Let's say it's a bunch of keys or it's Stuart's shoe or whatever. There's a standard scent that they follow, or stick, their bone, or whatever it is. Their toy is a good one. You habituate the animal to find that in smaller and smaller scent levels. And then you start to associate that scent to the scent that is your target scent, which could be, dead squirrels in a forest or whatever. And then that's your animal tuned into the scent that's your objective. And then it's as simple as then you take your marker scent away. They're tuned in on finding the scent that you're interested in them, whether it be a drug or a weapon or a shoe or whatever it is, and then they will find that. They will basically, if it's a burrow, they will just stare at it and wag their tail. They don't give one or two barks. It's just a very simple signal, and then they'll keep doing that. Their reward is usually, sometimes it's a bit of food, but usually it's to get playing with their ball. I mean, it's just the simplest thing, and it's incredible to see. I've just finished a course there a few weeks ago in Northern Ireland where they were doing one for the first time, seeing all sorts of varieties of dogs, training in these basic skills that I've just spoken about and I haven't described very, very well. It's an episode, Tommy, for you some other time to talk about conservation detection dogs to some of these people, because it's a science in itself and it's really fascinating and a growing area, as Stu says. And we're only talking about seabirds here, but all sorts of applications for invasive plants, other invasive animals. I mean, these ground nesting species, of course, they're really vulnerable to, which is one of the big problems in Seabird Island, they're really vulnerable to mammalian predators. So that's why they come in at night, but it doesn't protect them if there's ferrets and polecats and mink and so on these islands. And, to manage these islands and protect them, which has been used, I think, by RSPB, for example, in Orkney now, they're using the dogs to help direct management efforts to control invasive mammals. So rather than putting up 15 cameras to detect if there's a rat on your island and bait and chew sticks and so on, take your dog because your dog will, at least if it doesn't find the animal, it'll know where in the abouts an island that you might put your traps.
That's fascinating. I might follow up with you, Kendrew, about these conservation detection dogs, because you're right, that sounds like an entire different episode.
Do you know, Tommy, the thing I think is most surprising is that it's taken us so long to do this, because the game bird people have been doing this for hundreds of years, probably.
True, very true.
It's been used in other parts of wildlife biology for a long time. It seems so obvious. It seems, I think, why didn't we think of this before?
There's quite often that's like, why didn't we think about this before? Yeah, that's sometimes the simplest ideas that are staring at you are the most difficult to realize that they are there. Listen, guys, just to finish off on all the techniques and technology that you're using. I heard that you were also using drones to count cliff nesting birds.
Yeah. So we were trialing that. Again, there's a lot of legislation involved in trying to get drones in the air, and so we couldn't really run it out across the entire project. And of course, we did want some of these counts. The old school method with cliff nesting counts has been pretty good. It's been pretty reliable. So we did trial it, and it seemed to work quite well for the big gulls. Tougher for the small things because they're harder to pick out. The biggest difficulty was actually getting the drone to land back on the boat, because of course the drones have a known home, and the boats move and drift during the flights, and the drones are trying to land in the sea while the guys are trying to get them aboard the boat. So I think the drones would definitely work well for some of the big gull colonies, essentially the ones nesting on the tops of cliffs, and those are actually quite hard to count. When you're in a boat in the water, you can just usually see one or two birds up at the edge. So sending a drone up to do the cliff tops is probably the way we'll end up doing those. There's a few places that could work, but less useful for the dense nesting guillemots and razorbills and things nesting densely on cliffs, just because it's hard to pick out individuals, and also it can be quite tricky. Guillemots and razorbills are slightly different color, but you need really good light just to see those colors well. And at some point, it becomes a law of diminishing returns, in that you might as well just count them while you're on the ground, rather than doing the film and then going back and trying to work out whether something's a guillemot or a razorbill. And
you were using like a consumer drones.
Yeah, little Mavic.
Okay.
Drone. I think we're allowed to mention brand names, I guess. But yeah, little Mavic, and but we had professional pilots because they were of a size that required a drone license to fly. So we had to get drone pilots in, and then of course we also had to get loads of licenses off the statutory agencies to fly drones in areas where they're. So I think unless I can see it being. Well, I guess because it's only been done a few times, I think probably that's why they were quite tentative about it. I think it might be a bit easier now. Certainly, Nature Scott were very interested in it, and I imagine they will go forward with some of that stuff.
Yeah. Especially that if you're can use bigger commercial drones that you can put a lot of equipment, like you say, like a thermal vision or other stuff.
Yeah,
that could be a really game changer.
Yeah, the big issue with the bigger drones is that you can't fly them as close to the colonies, because we're also looking at the disturbance the drones were causing, and of course the small ones are less likely to cause disturbance. The big ones more likely, and of course when you start causing disturbance, then people start getting nervous. Well, one, if you don't want to scare the birds off, you want to count, and two, people start getting nervous about predators moving in, nicking eggs and things like that. So there's a bit of a trade-off there.
You could use then those really tiny whoop drones, but then they're very prone to winds and so on. I guess there's a lot of winds in those habitats.
Yes.
Wow, that was fantastic.
The ultimate Tama here, of course, is a big drone that carries your scent dog to your remote island, and the dog moves it through all by itself, collects it, and brings it back, and we can all just.
I was going to say that exactly.
Of course, Kendrew, that would utterly negate why we do it, and we this is the tragedy of it, is that probably lots of the reasons these rather archaic approaches remain is because people really have good fun doing it, and it was fantastic fun. Being in some really wild places, seeing some fantastic animals, some amazing landscapes. it's very, as I said at the start, it was just life affirming for me. It really got me back into biology, you know.
Where you guys were camping on those islands?
Yeah, we camped on Rum. We Airbnb'd on Lewis, but we camped on Rum.
Wow. Yeah,
Including there's a little survey hut. It's called the Shearwater Hut, up in the mountains. We spent a few nights up there because one of the mountains we had to get to was quite a long walk from the base camp, and so we camped up in the mountains with the Shearwaters a few nights as well, which was really lovely.
Wow, I can only imagine. That is what we all like to do. Listen, folks. So just to wrap this up, I would like to ask you about the biggest impact on those birds. And one thing that there are ones that people heard about. Obviously, human disturbance, plastic in the ocean. Climate change obviously is a big one. But I also read somewhere that the way the fisheries are managed also can impact birds. Can you elaborate on those methods and maybe start with how different types of fisheries management impact seabirds?
Yeah, well, I think probably if you were to ask a seabird biologist, and there are such things as seabirds biologists, what number one would it probably be fisheries? I think would be the number one threat.
Number one?
Yeah, I think so. In two ways. One, through entanglement and gear, because seabirds get attracted to fishing vessels and then they get caught up. So I think all bar one of the world's albatrosses are red listed and it's largely because of interactions with fisheries. There's lots of work been going on. Those are quite often longline fisheries, and there's a lot of work going on to try and mitigate interactions such as, lines get shot underwater. They've got these pods that only release once the bait's underwater. There's a whole load of things going on there. So there's a lot of work going on about that. But we still get entanglement in nets and our birds, gannets diving into the cod end of nets as they're being drawn and get caught up and killed. So direct entanglement with gear and interaction with gear is one way. But I guess if you only have to know that there's a statistic going around from about 20 years ago where people worked out that the entire seabed of the North Sea was trawled on average 3 times a year.
Whoa!
Right. So that kind of fishing effort cannot do anything positive for seabirds, right? And those effects are cascading up, just because they're not catching maybe the fish that the seabirds are eating, you can still have cascading effects up through ecosystems. And so fisheries have got a kind of chimeric role they play, because in some instances birds are doing really well because of fisheries. So the discarding policy that the European Common Fisheries Policy brought in meant that things like fulmars probably and many of the gulls and scavenging species did really well, including things like gannets probably took a big advantage of it. But also the removal of fish, the removal of some of the smaller fish species, and certainly there was times in maybe 30 years ago where people were removing things like sand eels for fish meal. Yeah. And in fact, the Danes actually had a sand eel oil-fired power station at one point, believe it or not. That's long gone now. But I think there was evidence that the removal of those prey fish had some impact on breeding seabirds that are feeding on the smaller things. So because our marine food webs are interconnected, removal of one part of it tends to cause tumbling and cascades that you really can't really predict. So I think fishing probably is the number one threat to seabirds, either via entanglement or by changing the food webs that they're feeding in.
Well, now that answers the question.
I would agree in that. I mean, that could well be the fulmar declines that Stuart has referred to, that they detected in the west coast of Scotland, has probably reflected that impact, because there's some evidence to show that they're interacting with longline fisheries just like the albatrosses. So the same thing is happening in the North Atlantic as well, perhaps with them. And it's very worrying, which is why, this Interreg project is so important, because we can't monitor these things as frequently as we would like, because it's such a labour intensive and complex procedure. But at least you've got to do these large health checks. You've got to do smaller scale annual monitoring and annual productivity monitoring of the seabirds, and obviously all this other work, which is where these occasional bigger projects come in, as they're not just looking at the seabirds, they're looking at fisheries, they're looking at climate change, they're looking at oceanography, they're looking at management, and they're looking and of course management entails working with the other stakeholders, including very importantly the fishing community, people's livelihoods, trying to influence policy at a European level, etc., etc. So it's all part of one big process.
And I think especially in things like the non-breeding season, many of our birds are in places like West Africa where there are huge unregulated fisheries going on. And so it might not just be, what happens in the North Sea. It could be what happens in other parts of the world that really cause problems with these things. So there's a huge unregulated fishery off the coast of Senegal where there's boats from all over the world exploiting it. And of course, when we track things like gannets and skuas, they all end up down there. They all end up round off there because, of course, that's where, partly possibly because that's where the fishing boats are, but also that's where the fish are as well.
Yeah. That's a typical problem with those migrating species, right? That you can do all the management and protection measures in one place, and then they fly somewhere else, and everything is not regulated. What would be the second biggest impact? Would it be climate change after fisheries?
I think climate probably, yeah. So there's certainly evidence that the northern distributions of some of these important prey fishes are moving. So they're moving slowly northwards. So I think there's evidence from Shetland and Iceland that some things are slowly moving northwards, and that will obviously now the seabirds may be able to respond to that by shifting their distributions. But I think climate is going to have a huge impact on this planet, and it's quite hard to predict what it might mean for some of these species. But certainly, if important prey species distributions move offshore or further north, then we will lose seabirds locally, and we may lose them if they can't find places to breed or move to. Then we may lose them more in a more widespread manner.
Right. And have you seen any indications of climate change impacts locally in terms of drier seasons or anything like that? Does this have any impact on those birds?
It's really hard to measure these things because the big problem we've got with seabirds is they live so long, and of course, so effects of climate are quite hard to detect over we've only been really studying these things for about 40 or 50 years, and that's really maybe 1.5 lifespans. So actually, it's quite hard to really detect effects of climate change. But we know from things like from other parts of the world, off the west coast of North and South America, El Nino years have a huge impact on seabird productivity. Now, the seabirds there are geared to that. They are evolved to deal with periods of low productivity. So they just have years where there's big die-offs and they don't breed, and then other years where they produce loads and loads of offspring. So they're a bit different. But we know climate can influence breeding biology of a number of species. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be influencing it. It's just quite hard to detect.
That's the problem. Okay, and tell me whether disturbance by human activities is this playing a big part in impacts or threats that those seabirds are facing? Because you mentioned they're on the islands, but not all of them are on the island. So I guess I'm just curious. I guess the question has two parts. In general, seabirds and their impact of humans pushing in with their leisure activities and expanding population, and whether this has any impact on those birds nesting on the islands and so on, or are they at least protected from this?
I think for the most part, access is at the big places is quite tightly controlled, and I think quite well controlled. So the big places you'd think of like Bempton Cliffs, or some of the big English mainland colonies, the access to the animals is pretty well choreographed. So I think disturbance is probably minimised in a lot of these places, and I would probably argue that many of the other places there may be small scale disturbance effects, but the visitation rates are low enough that it doesn't really create too many problems. I can't really think of any examples. I mean, we do know that there was some heart rate monitor studies people did with skuas. I know it was ever published, but they showed that when these birds would sit tight in their nests, but when people approached them, their heart rates would go through the roof. They would really start beating really fast. So although they looked calm, they were screaming inside, and one can imagine that could be quite detrimental over long periods. Certainly, when they removed, there was on the Bass Rock, there used to be a path that went over to the lighthouse on the far side that you could walk across, and then they stopped access to the island and stopped people walking it. And the gannets are all over that path, whereas they used to be quite far away from it. So that does suggest that maybe human activity was preventing them from moving onto it. But I don't think that human disturbance is one of the biggest issues. I think probably, we haven't spoken about wind farms. Wind farms probably another, maybe an important issue. It's still, I think the jury's out a bit on wind farms, because we simply don't know enough about how likely the animals are to collide with them, or what the cost of avoiding them is. That we need to do a lot more work on that. But I don't think human disturbance, direct disturbance by humans, is a huge issue. But there will be examples, doubtless, where somebody's driven a boat up and scared everything off a ledge and all the eggs have fallen off. There doubtless will be examples of that. I just think at a population level, it's probably not that important.
Oh, gotcha. So locally, right? Like the oyster catchers disturbed by surfers or stuff like that. It's local, but not on the population level. You mentioned those wind farms. You mean those offshore wind farms?
Yeah, offshore wind's a big is raised a lot of concern amongst people working on seabirds because of the potential for collisions and basically the cost of trying to fly around them. So there's an awful lot of work going on as far as that goes, but we still don't know. The problem is it's one of those horrible things where you've actually got to do the experiment to know what the answer is, because we still don't really know how likely the birds are to collide with them. They're very good at seeing them and they're very good at avoiding them, but we simply don't know what the likelihood of collision is very well. And we also do not know what the costs are associated with avoid. So assuming they see them, they have to fly around them. So, what is the cost associated with that? Is there an energetic cost? Is there a lost opportunity? We just don't know enough of that. I mean, there's lots of people working on that and modelling that, but there's still a lot of uncertainty in that. But wind farms would be another certainly concern. Whether it's a major concern is not clear.
All right, guys, I'm going to finish off with a question. I'm always finishing off and I'm always asking this question. If you listen to previous episode of the podcast, you probably know already what's coming. And my question is like, what, as people who are on the forefront of working with wildlife, animals, and see, all the changes that are going on and impacts, of everything that we just discussed, how do you see the future play out of oceans, birds, wildlife? Are you optimists? Are you a pessimist? Are you what are your thoughts on this?
I would say I'm very much on the fence. I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I mean, put it this way: in no matter what happens, in a million years there'll be stuff here, right? No matter what happens, something will be here, right? What that might be is the thing that we're uncertain about. But I think I feel quite, although I don't think people are moving fast enough, I feel quite encouraged by the fact that we have COPs. We actually have people discussing these things and trying to do something. They're maybe not doing enough, but they're trying to do something, which is better than doing nothing. Whether we get there in time to stop mass extinctions or not, I'm not sure. But at least we will stop it being as bad as it could be if we don't do anything. And I think with respect to seabirds, I think they're probably buffered a bit because they are, the sea is this great buffering thing for our Earth. It stabilizes temperature, and so I think seabirds might be better buffered, although there is evidence that the increasing winds may be good for some species and bad for others. So there will be losers and winners in that. But I think in general, I'm hopeful that things won't get too bad. I think people will hopefully wake up to the problem before it's too late.
Stu, I pencil you as an optimist.
Yes.
Check. Kendrew, how about you?
Well, I think I'll echo. I'll probably be in the same category. You could get yourself. I, like Stu, work at all sorts of different birds and all sorts of different habitats and migrants and residents and wee birds and big birds and seabirds and raptors and all sorts of things. And at every turn, there's a depressing story because something is, the world on land and sea is in certainly a very bad shape. But we can't afford to dwell on the negatives, otherwise we'd never get out of the hole that we're in. And it's people like Stu and me and our colleagues that have a role to play. And sometimes it's showing people a seabird colony and how fascinating it is. And sometimes it's like Stu would be doing, it's advancing scientific knowledge on something. Sometimes it's informing politicians in Brussels about something or whatever. But we've got a really important role that is a whole lot of fun on the journey and is fascinating, but to try and bring this to people, to bring about change, to get us out of that otherwise depressing hole we're in. And there's nothing else but to roll up the sleeves and just keep at it.
And we've always got the trump card of the puffin. Right, we can't. We could stop everything if we said puffins were going extinct. People would do everything to save them.
I wish that's true. Guys, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it was a pleasure talking with you.
Nice to talk to you, Tommy.
Likewise, thanks.